Well, I first came across this chap about 13, 14 years ago when I first began carrying out research into World War I tunnellers. Back then, every National Museum site had to do something on World War I. And it made sense for Big Pit to look at what miners did both at home and in the armed forces, but with a particular emphasis on tunnellers. So that's where I came across him. As part of Big Pit's programme for World War I, we produced a bunch of exhibitions as well as this little magazine, which is, I believe, still available on the National Museum's website for download. If not, and you want a copy, let me know and I'll email you a PDF. The best thing that happened shortly after we delivered this program was that I retired. But I continued to carry out research into tunnellers because as a mining engineer, colliery manager, the story of the tunnellers was of interest to me. And I started doing talks on tunnelling. And indeed, the very first external talk I gave on tunnelling was for Brian Davis over in the chapel across the way. The second talk I gave was for the Abergavenny History Society, big society, over 100 people in the audience. Went okay until we got to the questions. Answered most of the questions fine, but then some awkward bugger said, "What happened to him after the war?" Cardinal sin for a mining engineer to admit you don't know, but I had to commit it on that occasion. So I thought, right, we'll find out about it. And as Alice said, if you Google him today, you'll find dozens of websites with loads of information on it. Back when I first started looking at it, you'd have half a dozen websites and they'd all reproduce the same sort of 2 or 3 paragraphs of basic information. Luckily, I came across a magazine written for a history society in 1969 in Rhodesia, not Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. And
sorry, mate.
You're dismissed. I also came across newspaper cuttings on it from all over the world. He's in Hansard because, as we see, he became an MP. But I was starting to struggle on some of the finer detail. Okay on his war service, but outside his war service, I was starting to struggle on some of the details. And I'm blown. I've been hay on why, and what do I find? A book written by his granddaughter. If I'd found that about 6 months earlier, it would have saved me a lot of work. So what you're going to hear today is about 50-50, some of my own research, but some of the finer detail provided by his granddaughter. I'm just going to read something out to begin with. I don't normally read stuff out, but I'll just read this little bit out. A larger-than-life figure, John Norton Griffiths was handsome, physically imposing, and had the strength and endurance of a prizefighter. He was also a charming swashbuckler and a persuasive showman. He was considered one of the most dashing men of the Edwardian era. Men invested in his projects and women were attracted to him. All the men hate him already, and all the ladies were thinking, intriguing. He was also a man of fiery temperament, rebellious nature, and uncontrollable rages. And he looks it, doesn't he? He looks it. He lacked discipline and perseverance, and some of his projects were spectacular financial flops. But he was one of the great engineering contractors of the British Empire, achieved prominence as a backbench MP, served in the army on 4 occasions, and made important contributions in 2 of the major conflicts of the age. So this is him then. Lieutenant Colonel Sir John Norton Griffiths, 1st Baronet of Warnham, or Empire Jack, as he came to be known. With a name like Griffiths, it should be of no surprise to find that he is of Welsh extraction. His grandfather and father ran a builder's merchants and builders in Llanspydded, which is about 2 miles west of Brecon. And if you know Brecon at all and you've been to the Indo market there, they built that building and a number of the buildings around there at the time. Now, Jack, as he was known by the family, not John, Jack's father's first wife and his first son had died whilst they were at Llanspydded, and that's the gravestone in St Catwg's church. And if you're into churches, that's worth a little look. A very nice place. When Jack's grandfather died, his father thought, well, I've lost my wife and son, I've lost my father, time for a change. So off he goes to the northeast of England to train as a clerk of works. And a clerk of works is like a step up in the building industry from being a building contractor. Whilst he's there, he meets a young lady, they marry, and they begin this sort of peripatetic life, moving from job to job, mostly in southern England, working on churches, stately homes, etc. If anybody's been to Glyndebourne, the opera place, well, Jack's father worked on that. Jack himself was born in 1871 in Somerset. But then the family moved to London, near Hammersmith in London, and that's largely where Jack was brought up. In the terminology of the day, he was said to be a precocious child. I think we know that means he was a little bit. He was into everything. He was always in trouble. On one occasion, he got expelled from one school, so his father arranged some private tuition for him. But at the end of the first term, the tutor gave his father back the cheque that he gave him on the basis that Jack had never turned up for lessons. But even as a child, it would seem people recognised he had something about him. He was able to make friends with the great and the good of this world, as well as tramps and vagabonds and all sorts of people. And this was something that would stand him in very good stead in later life. His father eventually managed to get him a job as an apprentice draftsman in an architect's firm, no doubt pulling in some favours from people he knew. But office life was not for Jack, so one day he strolls across the Knightsbridge barracks and enlisted in the Royal Horse Guards. He is 16, so whether he had to lie about his age, I'm not sure. His father, as you can imagine, was initially furious, but then he relented and perhaps he thought, well, perhaps the army's the best place for him. And it certainly seemed to be the case, because he took to the life. He learned how to ride and shoot well, he earned prizes in both apparently, and he seemed to be settling down and getting on. But again, in a theme that will repeat itself throughout his life, it was not the last. Because after less than a year, something else came up a bit more interesting. South Africa. And now I'm not going to try and give you a blow-by-blow account of the history of this neck of the woods in the latter half of the 19th century. Suffice to say, there was a hell of a lot going on. And Jack would find himself right in the middle of it all, and he would meet many of the key players. His involvement all began when he bumped into an old childhood friend from school days, a guy called Percy Kimber, whose father was this chap, Sir Henry Kimber, who was an MP and chairman of this Natal Land and Colonisation Company. And this company existed in order to try and develop Natal. And what it would do, it would give prospective colonists £150 and a plot of land if they go out and try and make a go of things. One of the people who had taken up this offer about 18 years previously had been Cecil Rhodes. Yeah? And he'd come back into this story several times. And Percy, Jack's friend, had been nagging his father to let him go out to Natal and have a go at sheep farming. His father, being a sensible chap, didn't want his young son to go on his own. the upshot of all this was Sir Henry buys Jack out of the army, and off the two lads go to Natal to become sheep farmers. Percy is 21, Jack is 17. Different world entirely. Completely different world. Where they're going is just north of Pietermaritzburg. Oh, this is not working on there. And at a place called Dargle. And this is Dargle today, very beautiful area. Incidentally, it's around here in 1962 that Nelson Mandela was captured and spent the next 30 years in jail. Jack seemed to take to the life straight away. He would often spend all day in the saddle doing whatever sheep farmers do or hunting. And he almost immediately became what was termed in those days a colonial. Yeah? One of these sort of rough outdoorsmen. But once again, it was not to last, because something even more exciting than sheep farming came up. As if there could be such a thing. Gold. Gold had been found in Johannesburg. No, this isn't working. Johannesburg, which is around about there, just south of Pretoria. You won't see it on this map because gold was found in 1886 and this map was drawn in 1885. So up until finding of gold, Johannesburg just didn't exist. Jack and Percy land in Natal 2 years later, bit of sheep farming. Ooh, hang on. And just like thousands of other people, other men, Jack goes up to Johannesburg to try and make a fortune for himself. And thousands of people went there, mostly British, but some other nationalities as well. So off he goes, leaving Percy down here with his sheep, and off he goes to the Transvaal to make his fortune. Johannesburg at that time was like the African equivalent of the Wild West. It was a pretty rough place. Is that John Wayne or Audie Murphy below? And it was a hard place to make your fortune. It wasn't like the California gold rush where you could just pound for gold. Here the gold had to be mined. And mines cost money to set up, and obviously Jack didn't have a great deal of money. So in order to make ends meet to begin with, he sold buttons on the streets of Johannesburg. But then, again, this ability to make friends kicks in. He ends up lodging with a guy called Captain Maynard, who is something in one of the gold mines. Through him, Jack gets a job in one of the gold mines, and then a couple of years later, he's a deputy manager of one of these gold mines. And it's, as I say, a rough place. He had all sorts of adventures whilst he was there, one of which happened one night when he was walking through these sort of tent lines that had been established. He hears a woman screaming. Bursts into the tent, there's some bloke beating a woman up, so he beats the bloke up, rescues the damsel in distress, and ends up living with the woman for the next few years. There must have been something in the relationship, though, because in 1893, when she's on her deathbed, he marries her. Yeah? So, he's been an apprentice draftsman, he's been a soldier, he's been a sheep farmer, he's been a gold miner and selling buttons. He's now a deputy manager of a gold mine. He's been married and widowed, and he's 22 years of age. Keep saying it, it's a different world, different world. Whilst Jack was in Johannesburg, he met a number of people who, like him, had come to South Africa with nothing and made fortunes for himself. Guy over there, Cecil Rhodes, don't need to tell you anything about him. Guy in the middle is a guy called Barney Bernardo, and the guy this side is Sol Jolly. Jolly Sol, I can't remember which. Sol Jolly, I think. He became a sort of lifelong friend of Jack's and would finance many of the projects that he would work on in later life. Now, they were all businessmen, primarily businessmen, men, but they all dabbled in politics to a certain amount, none more so than Cecil Rhodes, of course. And they were all involved in one shape or form in Jack's next adventure. The 1896 Jameson raid. Now this was essentially a Cecil Rhodes-inspired attempted military coup of the Boer Republic of the Transvaal. And this makes it look like some sort of noble, heroic, exciting adventure. The result was something entirely different. It was a farce from beginning to end. Jameson and his men were very quickly surrounded, arrested, and Jack was also arrested. Why was he arrested? Well, the upshot seems to be that he was a suspected fifth columnist, because what was meant to happen was that Jameson and his men would get to Johannesburg, which was the target of the raid, and there the outlanders as the board called them, the British, would rise up in armed rebellion and overthrow the Transvaal government. And there were more British in the Transvaal at that time than there were Boers. They had a chance. No. As I say, it was a dismal failure. So it's thought that Jack was perhaps one of the ringleaders of these guys who was going to rise up when Jameson got there. It would appear, however, that they couldn't prove anything against him, but nonetheless, just to be on the safe side, they decided to kick him out of the country, to deport him. So he was escorted to the border by two Boer policemen, put on a train and sent packing. So he thinks, just about go home then. But when he's on his way down to Durban, and Durban is down there somewhere. Oh, it is working. Just doesn't work on there. Right. So Durban is down here somewhere. So he's on the train going down to Durban, and he hears that there's been a native rebellion in Rhodesia, or Southern Rhodesia as it was called there, where Jameson and his men had been the police force. So the police force shoot off down south to invade the Transvaal, and the natives think, well, just as well have a bash. It starts with the Ndebele, or what we call the Matabele, and then the Mashona in the north of the country kick off as well. And a number of relief columns are sent in. Two come in from the west, and there's one being sent up the coast. It's going to land in Beira in present-day Mozambique, and then get into Umtali, and then work in Mashona land, around Salisbury, present-day Harare. And Jack gets to Durban just as this relief force docks in Durban to take on supplies and extra men. Cut a long story short, Jack meets the commander, ends up being appointed to something called the Honey Scouts, which, as the name would suggest, is a force that's going to scout in front of this Mashonaland field force as it works its way into the north of the country. And this is the sort of country they can be operating in, and I've actually been to this area, and it's rough country, and these sort of kopies, as they're called, they're like natural fortresses, so it wasn't going to be easy. But the main fighting only lasted about a year, and there's Jack right at the back, there with a very impressive moustache. And he did quite well during the short war. He was promoted to lieutenant. He was mentioned in dispatches a few times. And after about a year, with most of the fighting over, a new police force was needed. It was going to be called the British South African Police Force. And Jack was recommended for a commission in this force by none other than Cecil Rhodes himself. And this is some of the police force. Now, if you can spot the difference between them guys and them guys, you're a better man than me. They're basically the same people. And so he becomes a lieutenant, then a sub-inspector, then an inspector, then he becomes the Justice of the Peace for the whole of Mashonaland, so the whole of present-day Zimbabwe. He was the Justice of the Peace for. As well as doing whatever Justice of the Peace did in those days, he also managed to register a gold claim in Rhodesia as well. So he's doing okay, he's not making a fortune, but he seems to have settled in. But then in early 1899, he gets a telegram from one of his sisters saying that their father had died, and that he needed to go home to sort out the family's affairs. So off he goes down to Durban to catch a ship. He can't get a ship all the way direct back to London. He's got to change ships in Zanzibar. And this is the sort of hotel that he's got to stay in for a couple of days. Like in a lot of hot countries, a central courtyard, etc. No doubt in those days with some sort of pool or whatever. And this is where he meets his second wife, one Gladys Wood, who was on the way back from South Africa with her mother and her then fiancé. And this is where she meets Jack for the first time, because she's staying here as well. So imagine some young Edwardian lady sat up on the veranda there drinking iced lemonade or whatever. And this is what she wrote in her later life about their first meeting. Suddenly there was a commotion downstairs. She did it without the Welsh accent, by the way. Suddenly there was a commotion downstairs. Footsteps, voices. A deep male voice I hadn't heard before. A tall, slim man strode into the courtyard. He carried a mongoose on his shoulder and a parakeet on his finger. Well, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? He was, of course, in whites, with an open shirt and a Panama hat. And he was the handsomest man I had ever seen. I fell in love with him at that moment. Sounds a bit alright, doesn't it? Now, if you didn't hate him before, guys, you certainly hate him now. Yeah? 3 days later, Gladys, her mother, and Jack gets on the ship going to London. Her now former fiancé gets on the ship going back to South Africa. Now, I told him he had something about him, didn't he? Well, he certainly must have had something about him. Back in London, they decide that although they're very much in love, they haven't got the money to get married. So, having sorted his family's affairs out, back he goes to Rhodesia to try and make something of his job and his gold claim. Not long after he lands back in South Africa, however, the Second Boer War kicks off when the Boers invade Natal and the Cape Colony. Things did not go very well for the British to begin with. They were caught napping. A number of people were dismissed, none more so than this chap, Sir Redvers Buller, who was one of the top British generals of his day. And some books would argue that he was unfairly sort of criticised. He wasn't dismissed entirely. He kept control of the troops in Natal, and it was his men who actually relieved Ladysmith, etc. But the guy who replaced him was really the top boy of his day. Lord Roberts of Kandahar, or Bobs, as he was known by the British troops. Only a little guy. but he was very good at his job, and he'd been chastising natives on behalf of the British here, there, and everywhere. None more so than in Afghanistan, but in Sudan, all over the place. And although he was very good at his job, he didn't know the country, so he needed people who did. By this time, Jack had been given command of a squadron of a unit called Brabant's Horse, so he's already in the war. But the upshot of it all was he gets appointed as a captain and adjutant on Lord Roberts' personal bodyguard, on his staff. And as I said, Roberts was very good at his job, and although some of his subordinate commanders made some mistakes, such as Kitchener and a guy called Sir John French, both of whom we'll come back to, within about 9 months, Roberts had defeated the main Boer forces, captured the capitals of both republics, and a number of their top generals. And this is an illustration of them accepting one such surrender. And the chap stood at the back, but there is said to be Jack. Yeah. Now, with most of the fighting over, Roberts goes back to London, where he's very keen to land and then leave straight away, because he's due to become Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, and that's the job he's always wanted. At the same time that Roberts leaves, Jack leaves. The war would go on for another 18 months as a sort of guerrilla war, under the command of Kitchener, who was Roberts' second in command. And although Jack was mentioned in dispatches several times, he apparently didn't fire a shot in anger during the Second World War, but he was nonetheless very important for his future, because he met, as young officers, many of the men who in the First World War would be the generals and corps commanders, etc. None more so than Kitchener and Sir John French. But back in Britain, Gladys and Jack decide to get married, and then he sets out on a new career. He doesn't go back to Rhodesia and the police and the gold mine. Instead, he becomes a contractor. And he does 2 jobs in short order, which make his name as an engineering contractor. The first one was in the Ivory Coast, which, someone help me, it's somewhere up there, isn't it? The white man's grave, and it's the building of a gold refinery for alluvial gold. It takes him 2 years to do it, lots of trials and tribulations, all sorts of tussles, builds it, big tick in his engineering CV. On the back of that, he got the next job, which was building a railway in Angola. It's called the Benguela Railway. It's going to start on the coast, the place called Lobito Bay, and it's going to go all the way to Rhodesia. And it's a bit of a troubled project. They've had a go at it a couple of times and failed. But then Jack decides to have a go at it. Gladys says to him, well, hang on, you're a miner. What do you know about building railways? He said, well, I've watched. And on that basis, he takes the job on. First problem they've got is there are no ports facilities in Lobito Bay. So the first thing they have to do is build a jetty in Lobito Bay. And this is them pictured, because Gladys went with him, this is them pictured coming ashore on that first jetty. And my, do they look very English and very Edwardian, yeah? Now, the second problem they had, this is Lobito Bay today, and down there there's supposed to be a plaque marking the site of that first jetty. Second problem they had, apart from the terrain, the climate, the natives, the wild animals, and all the rest of it, was that they didn't have a workforce. There were no skilled railway labourers in Angola for the simple reason there'd never been a railway there. But in South Africa, there were thousands of such workers, where the British had been importing Indian workers for decades to build the railways there. So leaving Jack to get things set up, off goes Gladys to South Africa, to Johannesburg, where her brother is now a solicitor, and together they go to see a young Indian lawyer who's very active in looking after the rights of Indian workers in South Africa. Now this is that young Indian lawyer when he was a medic in the British Army. This is him when he's a young, you got him, haven't you? Yeah? You could not make it up. You could not make it up. And in later life, this is what Gladys said about Gandhi. Such a nice little man, pity he gave us so much trouble later on. But at the time, with Gandhi's help, they got 30,000 Indian workers, shipped them off to Angola and began work on the railway. Gladys again stayed with him. They lived in a railway carriage which doubled as a travelling office. And she actually did much of the paperwork on the project. And again, cut a very long story short, terrain, animals, natives, climate, disease, everything. The job, the first 100 miles of the job gets completed. This is hailed literally around the world as a magnificent achievement of British engineering. And based on this job, he's able now to expand all over the places. One of the places he expanded to was Canada, where he set up a number of companies. One of those companies built this building. There's a good-looking chap there, look. It was called the Dominion Trust Building. Today it's called the Dominion. And when it was completed in 1910, it was said to be the tallest building in the British Empire. And when I read that first, I thought, no, that can't be right. I spent weeks typing away, trying to find something to disprove that. Can't. It apparently was the tallest building in the British Empire, but only for 2 years. Because I haven't got a photograph of that one, about 300 yards away, just down the street, they built another building, and it was taller. He didn't have any involvement in that. But he also opened up companies in this country, and there he is pictured with one company that dug sewers in Liverpool and Manchester. It was here that he came across a group of people and a technique called clay kicking, which would prove very important in the First World War, when he got into the tunnelling war. And I'll very quickly explain what clay kicking is. Instead of hacking away at the clay with a shovel or a pick, all the guy does is lie on a plank of wood, essentially, and pushes what was called the grafting tool into the clay using his feet. Now, why did they do it in civilian life? Because it was easier and quicker, more efficient than using your hands. So they were able to tunnel quicker. Very important during the First World War. Gave the British an advantage. The other thing about this system is if you got another guy lying down on the side of there, catching the lumps of clay as they fell out, it could be done a lot quieter than hacking away at the stuff. Both those things would give the British a distinct advantage in the Flanders area, at least, over the Germans in the tunnelling war to come. He also had companies involved in around the coast, building various structures, Great Yarmouth Pier, one or other of the piers in Weston-super-Mare. Forgive me, see the South Sea or South End Promenade, South Sea, I think. And so he was doing a hell of a lot of work. But he also found time to become an MP. And he went about electioneering as you would by now expect of this sort of a guy. On one occasion, when he felt a heckler had gone too far, he got down out of off the stage, caught over to him, and punched him out. Got back up, finished his speech, and got elected. Incidentally, the same thing would happen about 18 or so years later, when he stood for as an MP again. Again, a heckler went too far. He felt he went too far. He punched him out. This time, he was summoned 10 shillings for assault, but he improved his majority. It'd be fun to see some of our MPs having a bash at that, wouldn't it? But as if and he became quite a prominent backbench MP, and he had various nicknames. One was Hellfire Jack, presumably because he said hellfire a lot, although apparently his favourite word was cowson. Now, would you be offended if I called you cowson? I never heard of it before. Cowson? Well, it literally means that, son of a cow. He was also, by some of his detractors, called the monkey, because rather unwisely he admitted to eating a monkey when he was shot a grub in Africa. But the name that stuck more than any, of course, was Empire Jack, because he was a thoroughgoing imperialist. And in 1910, for an MP to stand out as a thoroughgoing imperialist, he must have been a thoroughgoing imperialist. So Empire Jack was the name he was given. Later in 1910, as if becoming a member of parliament wasn't enough, off he goes to South America with Gladys to look at a job in Chile. Only they land in Argentina, do some business there, sorting out things or whatever, and then they've got to cross the Andes to get to Chile. But they've landed in June, which is the start of the southern winter. So they've got to cross the Andes through snowdrifts, blizzards, all sorts, and that's them crossing the Andes. When they get to Chile, the press in Chile go mental. This has never happened before. It's amazing. And I can't say it in Spanish, but they call it the intrepid English. So they go to look at the job, which is the Arica to La Paz Railway. Now, Arica is on the coast. La Paz is right up in the Andes, right next to Lake Titicaca, which is the highest lake in the world. He's not on his own doing the job. He's part of a British consortium, but nevertheless, he's very much involved. When the job is completed, it is not only the steepest railway in the world, it's the highest railway in the world. So he's doing well, isn't he? But then, of course, we come to the First World War. Now, I'm sure you know that Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914. Jack declared war 4 days earlier because he put this invite, the advert then, into the Pall Mall Gazette and had it cabled, as it was called then, around the British Empire. I won't read it out, you can read it yourself. It's basically an appeal to all former colonials like him who want to have a bash at the Bosch to send in their names and addresses. Thousands applied. After various trials and tribulations with authority, Kitchener was now Secretary of State for War. Arguments with him, cut a long story short, the second King Edward's horse is authorised to be raised. Not to be confused with the King Edward's horse, which is a completely separate unit. It was a yeomanry or a cavalry unit, if you will. And he actually paid for the raising of this unit out of his own money. It cost him £40,000. £40,000 a day is a lot of money. 1914, it's a hell of a lot. So he paid for the raising of this regiment himself. He's made major and second in command, and they begin training. And there the problems start, because these guys are colonials, as I said. Most of them are ex-British Army. They don't want to be square bashing, they want to be bashing the bosh. So one squadron threatens to sort of mutiny. He goes down to see him, takes his hat off, throws it on the floor and offers to fight them out. The prospective mutiny is quashed and they go back to training. Now, they would see action, first see action in May of 1915, and like most sort of yeomanry and cavalry regiments, they were split up, their various squadrons were split up and served in different divisions. They were eventually, or what was left of them, were eventually disbanded in 1917, and they went into the Tank Corps, the new Royal Tank Corps being formed. So quite an interesting story, just looking at what happened to them. But of course, Jack wasn't there to see any of this, because by then he'd gone on to other things, to tunneling. Now, don't need to tell you that by very early in the war, certainly by December of 1914, the trench lines had become established on the Belgian coast right through to Switzerland, so stalemate had come into being. That time, various ideas for trying to break that stalemate were first mooted. This is when the tank was first thought about, various other things. This is when tunnelling first came into being. Now, depending on what book you read, they'll say, well, Jack was the first one to come up with the idea of tunnelling. He wasn't. There was a guy called Rawlinson, who was a general in the British Army, who first suggested to Kitchener the raising of a battalion of miners, he called them, to tunnel under the Western Front. That didn't go down too well, apparently, with Kitchener. But then on the 14th of December 1914, again, depending on what book you read, Jack either wrote to him, to Kitchener, or went to see him and described his idea for using his moles, as he called them, the civilian sewer workers, to tunnel under no man's land and blow the Germans up in their trenches. Again, Kitchener, North Sir John French, from Boer War days, who is now the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force. Neither of them are too enthused with this idea. So just like Rawlinson, he's sent politely on his way. Then on the 20th of December 1914, the Germans fire 10 relatively small mines under a brigade of Indian troops, and more mines would follow. Now, they killed lots of people, but the psychological impact was actually bigger than the physical impact. Because believe it or not, by this time, by December, the troops, frontline troops, were getting used to being shot at and shelled. You could at least do something about that. But the thought of sitting there having a woodbine and all of a sudden being blown to hell because someone has silently dug underneath you was disconcerting, I think, is the fair word to use. The British, in a sort of bottom-up response, started forming ad hoc tunnelling units. The Royal Engineer Field Companies would start doing it, a bit of mining, battalions raised in mining areas would start doing a bit of mining on their own back. But then what were called either divisional or brigade mining parties were formed. A guy who commanded the Length Brigade, 4th Division's mining party, was this guy over here, Arthur Edwards, of Blaenavon, who was a surveyor at Big Pit, believe it or not, for a short period. He was a captain in the 2nd Battalion of the Monmouthshires. He was put in charge of this mining party, which consisted of men from his own battalion, as well as the 5th South Staffordshire Battalion, which was also raised in the mining area. And together they set about mining. And this is a photograph of his mining party. I wish I had a better copy of that because I love that photo. They're not exactly the Grenadier Guards, are they? They look like what they are, if you forgive my French ladies, bunch of hairy ass lads from the valley. Yeah? That's what they look like, because that's what they are. And at the time, these guys were said to have been the ones who fired the first British mine of the war. Today we know that at least 2 other mines were fired before it. But at the time, it was said it was them. He got the military cross. A couple of men got the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the brass bands when they came home on leave. Does it matter that they weren't the first? No, not really. But as sort of heroic, and just that story in itself is an interesting one to read. There was fighting underground, all sorts of things. But as heroic as the exploits of such ad hoc units were, they weren't at the coping with the sort of scale of mining that the Germans had gone for, because they'd gone for it in a big way. So on the 14th of February, Jack was called in to see Kitchener, and Kitchener told him, get me 10,000 of these moles, and I mean immediately. So Jack was put in charge of recruiting men for the new Royal Engineer tunnelling companies. And the Royal Engineers had lots of specialist companies, so it made sense for these tunnelling companies to be part of the Royal Engineers. So, of course, the first men he would look to and recruit were men from his own civilian companies, these clay kickers. Now, over the years, in order to find about 1,500 Welsh tunnellers, I've had to research about 6,000 or 7,000 tunnellers in total. And I've only ever found less than 2 dozen clay kickers. So most of the men who actually did the clay kicking were coal miners. And that's the next place that they turned to for men. They turned to battalions raised in mining areas, so men who were already serving as soldiers, and encouraged them to move to the tunnellers. One such man you may be interested to know about, which is mentioned in here, was a guy called Garfield Morgan, who worked at the Great Western Colliery. And he was reluctant initially to join the tunnellers, but then the Sergeant Major said, and your pay will be 6 shillings a day. That's for me, and that's how they got a lot of men. So they also began recruiting men direct from coal mines in this country. My wife's great uncle was a collier in Anasir in the Rhondda on the Wednesday of one week. By the Wednesday of the following week, he was working in 173 tunnelling company underneath the trenches of France. He didn't know how to salute, fire a rifle or anything. And eventually, about 33 tunnelling companies would be set up, and each company was the size of a small infantry battalion, either 300 or 500 men, because the establishment changed throughout the war. But attached to each tunnelling company would be a similar number of infantrymen who would act as beasts of burden, do the carrying and the humping for the tunnellers. So at its height, there were 30,000 British, Australian, Canadian tunnellers, or men, fighting the Germans under the Western Front. And Jack was everywhere, not only recruiting in this country, but trying to get these companies equipped, and even trying to direct, telling them where to mine and all the rest of it. He'd either ride around on a horse or in his wife's Rolls Royce, I would have much preferred to see the Rolls Royce, because in the back of the Rolls Royce he carried crates of wine. And if he thought you were doing a good job, he'd give you a few bottles, no doubt to inspire you to greater effects. I doubt whether many of the men would have had a taste mine. I think most of the officers would have quaffed it, wouldn't they? He was certainly the inspiration for the tunnelers' biggest success, which came in June of 1917 when they fired 19 mines under the Messines Ridge. Now, coincidentally, 19 mines had been fired at the Battle of the Somme. And if you read about the history of the Battle of the Somme in detail, what you'll find is where the mines were properly coordinated with the infantry attacks, the British managed to make some advances. Where they were poorly coordinated with those infantry attacks, the British struggled to make advances. But a year later, they learned their lessons. It is said that when these mines were fired, that 10,000 Germans died in an instant, that the sound, largest man-made sound in history up to that point, it was claimed, was heard in London, and even as far as Dublin. I think that's pushing it a bit, isn't it? Whatever the truth about it, what is certainly a fact is when these mines were fired, it allowed the biggest British advance of the war to date, after 3 years of war. But Jack wasn't there to see it, was he? Because by the time these mines had been fired, he'd done 2 other jobs and been to Romania and back. He'd actually left the tunnelers in early 1916, after about a year, because the British had gone for it in a big way. They'd set up a big, complicated organisation for tunnelling. They had training establishments, workshops. They even had mines inspectors and rescue stations, mines rescue stations under the trenches of the Western Front. So they'd gone for it in a big way, and Jack's job largely became redundant. So in early 1916, he's promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. He's given the Distinguished Service Order, and he goes to work for the Ministry of Munitions, where incidentally some of his companies were working on various projects for the Army and Navy, and where his civilian engineering skills, it was thought, would be of use. So he's doing that. Then in November of 1916, he's called into Department 6 of Military Intelligence, MI6. He's not the first James Bond, but he's there or thereabouts. And he's told he's to go to Romania. Now, Romania had entered the war in August of 1916, rather unwisely, because they were surrounded by the Austrians, the Germans, and the Bulgarians. And these armies started converging on Romania. They suffered a number of defeats, and it looked like the Germans were going to capture the Romanian oil fields. So if you know about the Second World War, they're actually very important then, they're important now. And Romania was also not just an oil producer, it was a breadbasket. It produced thousands of tons of grain. So the Allies are worried that the Germans are going to get their hands on all this. So Jack is called in, he's told you to go to Romania, blow up the oil fields and whatever else you can. Quite naturally says, what regiment am I to take? None. But you can take a Batman if you want to. So armed with £5,000 in expenses and his passport, off he goes, travelling via Norway, Sweden and Russia. When he gets to Russia, he meets this chap, the Tsar, gets his seal of approval, and Romania was Russia's big ally, the other way around. Then he goes to Romania to see this lady, who is again worth reading about in her own right, Queen Marie of Romania, who's actually British, George V's cousin. And George V, when he was a young man, he'd actually proposed to her. But she turned him down and married a Romanian prince instead. So now she's Queen of Romania. So Jack, in the end, goes to see her to get her seal of approval, which she gives him, but she warns him that some of the oil producers, the owners, and even some people in government will try to stop Jack carrying out his orders. And she begs him to persevere and get the job done, which he sets about. He's not entirely on his own. He's got a couple of guys from the British Embassy, a couple of Romanian officers as well, and they also co-opt whatever Romanian troops they can catch as they retreated. And they set about blowing up the oil fields and grain stores, etc. And they do a spiffing job. And it was a very hands-on job. On one occasion, it appears Jack had to be dragged out of one building unconscious and quite a bit singed. So they do a hell of a job, and sometimes they are just hours. They're doing this work just hours in front of the advancing German troops. Job done, he goes back to see Queen Marie, gets given the Romanian star, goes back to see the Tsar again, and he is apparently, according to his granddaughter's book, the last person to be awarded a medal in person by the Tsar. Because we know what happened to him and his family a couple of months later. The Tsar gives him a medal as well, as I said. So back to Britain he goes and finishes the war. When the war is completed, Jack is quite rightly seen as one of the heroes of the war. He's already been given a Distinguished Service Order. He's got Romanian medals, Russian medals. The French give him a medal. And these are his Boer War medals up here as well. So he's, as I say, considered one of the heroes. He's made a Knight Commander of the Bath. And that's when he becomes the first Baron of Wona. And this is when he hyphenates his name. Now up to this point, Norton had been one of his Christian names. But now he's one of the cracker, now isn't he? So you've got to have a double barrel name. And this is Warnham House in Surrey, I think it is, where they lived. So, he's doing well, but, he also helps to set up and fund the Comrades of the Great War, which a couple of years later, with a number of other organisations, come together to form the Royal British Legion. And he had a hand in starting all that and funding it. But then, as I say, Romania came back to bite him. Now, the Romanians had been promised that compensation for whatever Jack did, managed to destroy. So quite naturally, at the end of the war, they come cap in hand, saying, can we have our money, please? And that's when the arguments start. First of all, there's arguments within the British government as to which department should pay. Then the British say, hang on a minute, he wasn't doing this for us, he was doing it for the Allies. The Americans, the French, the Belgian, Uncle Tom probably and all should also coffer, not just us. Then they say, hang on, the Germans rebuilt some of these refineries and oil wells, we're not paying for it twice. And these arguments went on and on, lasted about a decade. At one point, the people who'd lost money in Romania tried to hold Jack personally responsible for their losses and took him to court. So it was quite a worrying time for him. What happened in the end? Well, the British government reluctantly agreed to pay up. But the Romanians didn't get a penny because what they said, we take it off the war debt that you've built up with us during the war. So not a penny went to Romania in the end.
Politics at its best.
Yeah. Then he was back to business. As I say, he was also still an MP, so he was still involved in that. But it's very much back to business. And again, he's very successful in some necks of the wood. He builds a railway in Uganda, he builds a port in Canada, works in Australia, all over the place, as well as Britain, of course. But it's now that he starts to make mistakes. He's no longer the guy on the ground floor, he's now the managing director sort of guy, isn't he? So he's having to rely on other people, and those other people presumably weren't as good as him. But also the world had changed, certainly after the First World War had changed. It was no longer the Victorian, Edwardian area where you could stick your chest out and sort of bully projects through by personality alone. Now it was a very technical, a very financial, a very contract orientated world. And as I say, he started to make more and more mistakes. The biggest mistake, incidentally, he made a mistake in Azerbaijan, showing how far afield he was working. He built a pipeline to Baku. The pipeline was built, but he got kicked off the job and lost a fortune. But his biggest mistake came with the Aswan Dam project. This isn't the building of the dam, it's the second heightening of the dam. And it was a problem, full of problems, project full of problems right from the beginning. He had problems with the Egyptian government, he had problems with the subcontractors, Egyptian subcontractors, who the Egyptian government told him he had to use. Then he had problems with the Wafists, who were a left-wing group who used the project to stir up trouble. So there were strikes, all sorts of things, so there were delays and delays and delays, costs were rising, and then to top it all, there was a Wall Street crash. Several of the investors pulled out. Gladys suggested to Jack that he also cut his losses and pull out, but he insisted he was going to stick with it. But things just got worse and worse. He was being nagged by the press, by the Egyptian government, by the British government as well. And as I say, there was a lot of pressure on him. When he was staying in Egypt, he was staying in Alexandria in this, what looks like a very nice hotel. Today there's a modern monstrosity in his place. And every morning he would go for a paddle on a little surfboard thing, go out into the sea and go for a little swim and then come back in. One morning the boat was seen to be empty. They launched a search and he was found floating in the water with a single bullet shot in his temple. Quite naturally and probably correctly, the inquest determined that he committed suicide because of his financial and other worries. Now clearly anybody's suicide is a tragedy, but I think, or I hope you'd agree with me, that it seems particularly tragic and unsatisfactory way for a man like him to go out as a suicide. Was it suicide? Because almost immediately, even before they shipped him home for burial, the rumours started. They never found the gun. And then in 1933, the self-styled president, I can't say this in German, president of the Society of Eastern European Jews, the Ashkenazium something or other, wrote to an author who was writing a book, Jack was going to feature it, claiming that they had done for him, they'd had him assassinated because of what he did in Romania. If you read into it, many of the people who lost fortunes in Romania had been of German and or Jewish extraction. So that seemed to make sense. Then it was noted that at the time he died, Queen Marie of Romania was in Egypt visiting with a large entourage. So right, it was one of her entourage who did for him. Then a couple of years later, with the rise of the Nazis, a new theory emerges. No, it wasn't the Eastern European Jews, it was the Nazis trying to get the Jews to blame. The answer is, we will never, ever know. And there, you would think, well, that's the end of his story. Not entirely the end of his family story, because some of his family had a little brush with history as well. So just to finish, I'll tell you a bit about that. First brush with history comes with this chap. He's a bit of a looker, isn't he? Any ideas? Emperor, you got him, Emperor Napoleon III of France. He was 2 times Emperor of France because he was out of favour, he was in favour, he was out of favour, in, and he was finally out. When he was out of favour, he spent a lot of time in this country. And you wouldn't believe it to look at him, but he was a bit of a naughty boy. And he had several illegitimate children, not only in Britain, but in Germany, Belgium, all over the place. And Jack's sister Fanny married one of his illegitimate sons. That's an interesting one. Then we come to Jack's family itself, and that's Gladys. Peter was the soldier, and he was the 2nd baronet on Jack's death. There is today a 4th, maybe even a 5th by now, baronet in Kenya, out in Kenya somewhere. Michael was killed at Dunkirk. He was in the Royal Engineers, and if you know anything about Dunkirk, you know what a wonderful job the Royal Engineers did there. Phoebe married a guy who was a squadron leader in the RAF during the Second World War. Then we have Ursula. Well, this is Gladys and Ursula in the early 1970s. Gladys lived to be 101. She only died in 1974. This is Ursula, who again, in her own right, is quite a formidable woman. I'm pretty sure I had a headmistress just like her. I wouldn't want to meet her on a dark night, that's for sure. And this is Ursula's son. Anybody recognize him? Give you a clue? She married a Major Thorpe. It's Jeremy Thorpe, the one-time leader of the Liberal Party. And things didn't end well for him either, did they? Now, so there we come to the proper end. And that is the edited highlights of this guy's life. The real story is even more extraordinary than the one I've told you. If you want to read it, get the book. It's available on Kindle and what have you. It's called Tunnel Master and an Arsonist. And now I would like to think, if I ever met this guy, because I'm a man of the world, I wouldn't like him. Yeah? I have a horrible feeling that he would have charmed me just as he seems to have charmed just about everybody else. But love him or loathe him, I think he really did deserve the title of Empire Jack, didn't he? Thanks very much.